So this year, the laureate was this group. It wasn't an individual. We were hoping it was going to be the Pope or maybe Angela Merkel. And in that case, I would have just gone and done sort of like a day in the life of, or a week in the life of the Pope in the Vatican or something. And I was quite excited about that too. But so when I found out on October 6th, every year the announcement comes on October 6th, that the Peace Prize laureate this year was this group, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN for short. We were like, oh no, what are we going to photograph? Like, it's a bunch of people, it's 100 little splinter NGOs around the world doing disarmament work, and essentially they are campaigners. So they have placards, banners, and they sit in an office and do a lot of emailing. And I'm like, uh-oh, it's not visual at all, what am I gonna do? So that's my starting point, and I decided to go kind of dive deep and do research into this topic, and I decided to make this body of visual work about the issue of nuclear weapons rather than literally on the laureate. So as a photographer, and giving this task of illustrating this topic for the Nobel Peace Prize last year, I was trying to figure out, how do I not just shock and scare or guilt trip people? Because that can lead to just inaction. How do I not overwhelm with this very abstract, heavy political issue? How do I make this very technical, complex issue accessible? And most of all, I suppose, how do I show something that we can't actually see? Elements of what I saw in both countries fed off my mind, fed off each other in my mind. Some of the parallels were clear as soon as I shot the second picture in the pair, and the others I discovered in the editing process. Across both countries, there were surprisingly striking similarities in the landscapes, both natural and man-made. Perhaps, as an American museum curator I met put it, we haven't learned from history. What the US did in the past is being repeated right now in North Korea.
We were talking earlier, and one of the things that we were discussing is the decision that you made against following a human interest narrative and moving into abstraction. And I'm wondering, even though you mentioned it earlier, if you'd like to say a little bit more about that, how it opens up the imagination in a very different way than a more human interest narrative might.
Yeah, so I mean, when we found out that the Nobel laureate was the ICAN, the first thought was, you know, they very much stressed the human consequences of nuclear weapons. And when you talk about the human consequences, there've only ever been 2 bombs dropped. So it's naturally Hiroshima and Nagasaki came to mind, and their first kind of knee-jerk reaction was, let's go make pictures of those victims who are still alive and their offspring, because nuclear poisoning, as it were, continues to pass down through the generations because your genes get scrambled. So that was the first thought, and you know, I'd come out of 15 years of journalism, and I know how to do a human interest story, both in writing and in photography. And my previous projects, which I'll share a little bit in your class on Thursday, are very human interest driven. So that would have been kind of like what I know how to do. And it would have been, in some ways, I think for some people, more moving. Because there were people who came to the exhibition in Oslo and said, but there are no people. Like, where are the people? Like, where's the human dimension of this? But I decided not to, for various reasons. I think one was that it's been done a lot. Like, there are many photo books out there about the Hibakusha. There are many photo projects, film projects that tell the story of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivors. And I didn't feel that repeating it or doing it again would bring something different or new to the table. And the other thing was this point that we were discussing earlier. Human interest stories are very powerful and moving, and they often lead people to cry or be truly touched. But they are also problematic in their own way. They are somehow reductionist. They reduce a huge political issue into the one person, which is also their power, so it's a paradox. And so it was a conscious decision to move away from that approach. And there were a lot of things that I saw that I did not photograph. So that's very different from how a journalist or a reportage, a documentary photographer would maybe do it. You probably go out there and shoot everything you can and come back having gathered all the stuff and then edit a set of work out of that. But this was a lot more intentional. I was kind of forced to. I mean,
yeah, there's not
2 months.
enough time. Yeah.
2 months to make it work.
Yeah.
And but I was it was very intentional. So some people have asked me, you know, a lot of people go to the China-North Korea border and they come back with a very different set of photographs. They're like, how did you do this, you know? It was very, you know, I drove the same roads. I didn't do anything that a tourist can't do. But I just saw different things because I did the research and I wanted to find different imagery. I wanted deliberately to find things that had a certain mood, had a certain, maybe even color palette. You know, I was just so struck by this picture when I saw it with my eyes. I wanted to photograph it. It's that one. So it was, I had to shoot it long exposure on a tripod, but I couldn't step out of the car because I was constantly afraid of being watched. So I mounted the tripod in the back of the car, the back seat, and I was like, nobody breathe. It's like basically it's a 15-second exposure. You actually, this really doesn't do it justice. If you look at the print, you can see streaks of the stars, basically. Oh, I can't go back. Anyway, it's about a 15-second exposure, and yeah, so nobody was allowed to move. And I was only able to take a few frames because then you had to be quick in these places. You can't stay for too long, you get busted.